Greetings, all you doom seekers and man-eaters. My name's Salamander, and for the momentous third episode of Farsight Radio, I'm joined by...
Me, Brian Yaksha. Hi.
Awesome. Hey, hello, man. It's great to get you in here, man. I really like Soulbound. I'm
Yeah,
actually...
it's a fun setting.
Yeah, I'm actually currently in, like, 2 different Soulbound campaigns. And
Nice.
am about to start GMing one too. So
Oh, hell yeah.
okay, so just to get into it, so who is on the other side of the monitor? Who are you? How'd you get into my
So,
house?
well, I am, for purposes of context related to this, I was one of the writers for, oh God, let me break out all of the colons in this. Warhammer Age of Sigmar roleplay Soulbound Champions of Order. I got to write on that, which was a wonderful occasion. I also contributed to the GM screen set of adventures way back when. I think I did most of this writing in and around late 2019, early 2020, prior to the COVID pandemic.
Oof, oof.
Yeah, which is why all of this is just like, when did I work on this? Was that in the long, long ago? And it
Right.
may as well have been.
You're really glad you said that exact word like a minute into the video, because otherwise I would have had to censor it.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no. YouTube fucking guns for you if you say like any no words within the first like 30 seconds of your video, and one of those words is COVID. Thankfully, we were like a minute and a half in when you said it. But
Oh goodness, I completely forgot about
you
that being even a thing.
you almost got the YouTube ninjas sent after me, dude.
Oh
No,
God.
it's great. So,
But yeah.
okay, so you worked on Warhammer Age of Sigmar Soulbound Champions of Order, and also the GM's kit. But where can people like find you?
I'm on Twitter at symbol Goatman's Goblet. Let's see. I've also, I mean, the reason I'm even in the position to have written for Cubicle 7 was I've got a pretty sizable like bibliography of works that I've contributed to, primarily in the form of iterative generative design, which is a fancy way of saying random roll tables.
Oh,
Uh, oh, I wrote a dissertation on it, but
really?
yes, I made good use of my time in grad school during the pandemic because it was like, well, what else am I gonna do? But
I'm locked
yeah,
inside. Better write a
exactly.
200-page paper about RNG tables.
Oh yeah, trust me, buddy, I could go on about those,
Oh
and
my
I
god.
probably will by accident.
Oh
But
no, that's fine. That's great. I love
but
that.
yeah, I've had a couple Any nominations. I've worked on. Oh, I've just recently worked on a very big Pathfinder 2E project as a, I guess, a cultural consultant writer. I
Uh,
think is probably the correct title for
oh,
that.
really?
Yes, the for Pathfinder Lost Omens Impossible Lands. A lot of colons in my work, it seems. But
Jesus. Yeah, you just collect colons, dude. Like,
yeah, that does seem to be the case, and that can't be taken out of any context. But yeah, and that was a lot of fun. And interestingly enough, I got to actually write the introduction for that book because the main writer for it, I believe, got sick and when it was
mm,
necessary to have it
mm.
done. So I got to be like, okay, let me jot something out. Followed immediately by, hey, so there's a lot of colonialism and really negative things that need to be said, and all of that made it into the book.
Oh
So,
no.
oh no, in a good way. Like it's like, yes, we need this accurate
Yeah.
commentary. But I was shocked by that, and I was
Okay.
happy.
Wow,
But
really? Yeah. So
yeah.
kind of like the opposite way that Wizards of the Coast is handling it, where they're kind of just like delete, just erase everything, just get rid of it.
I have thoughts
Oh
on
yeah.
WotC
Oh yeah.
outside of my own negative reasons for a very personal dislike of their
Right, yeah.
brands. But yeah,
I've not met many freelance tabletop role-playing game writers who just have just glowing opinions about their time working for Wizards.
yeah. Well, I mean, I never worked for them, but I suffered compounding issues from some people
mm,
who did,
okay,
which
okay.
I would say is probably a good bit to cut from this.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is not
Yes.
as much as that would probably like immediately launch my channel into like mega success. This is probably not the platform to air out like all of
Agree
the
completely.
industry's dirty laundry or something. You
Oh
know?
yeah, you know what, and that's the weirdest thing is I've had people who've made me their North Star on morality in the industry, and it's like, one,
Ooh,
never do
that's
that to a person. That's
oh my
so mean.
god. Yeah, no.
But
Ugh.
also, it's just like, hey, please understand that if I know all about this dirty laundry, it's because people keep throwing it at me.
It's
I am a witness to people throwing the filthiest laundry at me in person. This is not, don't look at me and think like, ah, yes, this one shall lead us into being kinder people. It's like, no, we should probably be wondering why people are throwing their soiled laundry at that person and in
right.
general.
Right. Yeah. I can kind of relate to that on a much smaller scale as I'm kind of one of the only people on YouTube who make like as directly and explicitly political content on Warhammer that I do. And a big
Oh, yeah.
part of the reason why I sort of changed a lot of my branding. I kind of stopped trying to be the Warhammer bread tuber or something was because I was getting a large audience of people who were, in my opinion, kind of trying to turn me into like the Warhammer ContraPoints. I'm like, no,
Oh,
no,
no.
no. I'm not here
No.
for that. I'm here to talk about little army dudes. No, stop it.
Yeah, jeepers.
Like
Yeah,
I'm not trying to be that.
I originally found you on your video about Sigmar and the God Emperor and the comparisons, and I don't know where I commented. It might have been in a
Yeah.
tweet about your video, just responding to it, because I usually see your videos originally before following you, retweeted by the artist who goes by Windlass, I believe.
Oh, Anna. Yeah, me and Anna are
Yeah,
actually like really good friends. Yeah.
yeah. So their art's great, and so I've been following them for
Right.
a bit, and I've seen a few things by way of them, and I think I made the point of commenting. I'm like, this is a really good video, but you miss like the most interesting point that I feel like is very important about understanding why Sigmar's failability is interesting, and that is
Right.
you can absolutely blame him for being a coward and like for essentially
Right. Yeah.
abandoning the realms and locking down. It's like, and if we're adhering to this is a divinity who's still effectively like a proto-Germanic-esque war god
Mm.
avatar, the weight of that shame and kinslaying and all of that just from
Right.
like allowing is like, oh,
Yeah.
that's gripping. He's lost literally all of his standing with his allies who can now point to him abandoning the fight because he got a little bit more wounded than he thought he would.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, that
I
hubris.
absolutely agree. So I do think one of the major flaws with my current style of writing is that I try to write my videos as if they're like one big giant discussion piece. So sometimes I don't cover everything with the
Hmm.
thought of like, oh, I'll talk about this in like another video later down the line. Um, which I think sometimes leads to my videos not being as comprehensive as they otherwise could be.
Hmm.
I have been thinking about slightly adjusting the way I write my videos in that regard because you're absolutely right. I did gloss over like a ton of really interesting stuff about Sigmar's character in
Yeah.
interest of like not making the video 45 minutes long, but maybe I should start making my videos 45 minutes long. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, or you could do smaller videos covering these various points. Like specifically, that those flaws are what allow, like, even even if you really like the God Emperor of Mankind, it's those flaws that allow Sigmar to be interesting, and it's that sort of stuff that gets glossed over by really a lot of the setting presentation as a whole,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
where it's
Yeah.
just like, yeah, if you read it, you get cool terms like the necroquake, which my roommate loves because he's like, I know exactly what happened just from hearing that word.
Right. It's so genius. It's like
Yeah,
an earthquake of necromancy. There you go.
yeah.
Necroquake.
And so like I you really do get the sort of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe vibe, but once you start reading it, it's like, oh, this is like extremely Dark Souls in tone,
Right.
and not even
Yeah.
like it's like, trying to like imitate that style. It's like, no, this is incredibly dark mythic level fantasy
Right. It's
that,
it's it's very it's very high fantasy, but in a way that's almost depressing.
yeah, it's to the point where I can understand how from like the distance it looks like it looks because I was originally, and we should probably get back to questions in a proper order because I
Right.
realize I'm going to cover several of these, but because I was originally a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay fan as like a kid, and it's like, and I love my agrarian German misery simulator. I love that, but if you look at Age of Sigmar and like even Soulbound specifically from the cover art, and that is like, this big heroic stuff. But once you're actually like reading it, there's
Right.
so much depth that almost feels undermined by like the toyetic aesthetic.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's like both very interesting, but also a little bit of a shame. Specifically, like I was turned off by Age of Sigmar when it first came out, and I was like 19 or 20
Yeah. I
because
think a
it's
lot of
been out
people
for a
were.
bit now.
Yeah, since like
And
2017.
wait, how old is? Gotta be
2017
older
was
than
5
that.
years ago.
I thought it came out. Oh, 2015. So I would have
2015?
been,
Oh, okay,
yeah.
yeah.
So let's see. I would have
So I was
been
7
in
years
my
ago,
early
actually.
20s. Yeah,
Yeah, so that was 7 years
yeah,
ago.
yeah.
Holy
And so
crap, that was
like,
7 years ago. Oh,
yeah, I remember the backlash and stuff,
oh. Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah, me too. Uh,
but
Especially
it
because I think we can all agree that Games Workshop really handled the initial launch of Age of Sigmar very poorly. Um, where it did indeed kind of feel like they were almost making fun of people for liking Warhammer Fantasy, where
yeah.
they added a lot of like elements of the game that could be interpreted as them like actively mocking or at the very least actively trying to disconnect Age of Sigmar as much as possible from Warhammer Fantasy, which is thankfully something I think they're kind of reversing. Um,
Yeah, they're definitely
yeah,
bringing more elements from that back. I'm very curious to see how Grand Cathay and Kislev are going to slot in to the
right,
Age of
yeah.
Sigmar. Like, even just as if they were like very specialized cities of Sigmar or their own thing, it's like
Hmm.
that will be interesting to see.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. So I think I think the second question I was going to ask has already been answered several times over at this point. Um, were you previously a fan of Warhammer before becoming a freelance writer for Cubicle 7, or did it just kind of fall into your lap? Like, how did it happen, and what was your prior experience with Warhammer before you became a writer for Cubicle 7?
Well, specifically, I played a lot of second edition, never more than, well, didn't
Right.
play, I ran. I am the forever GM. I ran a lot of second edition, and that fed into some of my very personal thoughts regarding the development of a sandbox, which
Yeah.
It's a whole thing that I've gotten way too academic and experimental about in the past, but it's a mechanism of moving parts I enjoy. And second edition had enough things to allow me to tinker with that. The first campaign I ever ran for a person or for people to completion was a Dark Heresy campaign, which was a
Really?
lot of fun. Oh yeah, I ran that when I was 19 years old,
Yeah.
prior to online tabletops. So I think we used Skype and
Wha-
uh, various dice lobby rooms.
was it Dark Heresy first or second edition?
Oh, first edition. This would have been many years before second edition.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, time is a flat circle.
How long ago was Dark Heresy second edition?
2014.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my god, my fucking head hurts, dude. I actually just took psychic damage.
Yeah. But
Oh.
yeah. But let's see, what else was there? I got the Cubicle 7 gig for this because Emmett Byrne, who's the head for the product line of Age of Sigmar
Okay.
for Cubicle 7, put out a general call for submissions, and I was like,
Yeah.
I am perplexed by this, so I made a big random generator table to try it. Well, because they give you so many questions at the start of the Soulbound book, and if you know nothing about the setting,
You have no idea how to answer them.
yeah, exactly. So
Right,
I
right.
was like, I know vaguely enough to do all these various permutations and try and make this work. And now having worked on Champs of Order and gotten a little bit more in depth with the setting, I'm like, oh no, not most of this could just I should probably fix this because this is not accurate to the setting, but it is accurate to a person who knows nothing of the setting.
Yeah, no, that actually, yeah. That does seem like something Cubicle 7 does a lot, where it's like they do a lot of general calls where,
Oh, oh yeah, and
yeah.
I mean that specifically, the making of permutations is what got me the Champions of Order role because I worked on the whole of the motivations chapter was a big thing, or
Okay.
rather the
Yeah.
goals, yeah, which was oof, I think
So while you were working on Champions of Order and later the GM's kit, what was it like inside? I guess it wasn't like a literal like writer's room, but what was it like inside the sort of like internal systems where decisions were made for
uh,
the stuff you were writing?
so it's gonna be kind of disappointing that it was very laissez-faire, very hands-off.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of the case of you wrote your bit, and if something needed to be changed or revised, Emmett was the one who was sending out the "Can you revise this to clarify this" kind of notes. But
Okay.
having worked in RPGs and stuff that have had more of a literal writer's room kind of thing going on, this one was very hands-off freelance work, and I
Yeah.
mean, I was fine with that. I do believe there was a room for us to like send things, but
Right.
once again, all of this is clouded from being in and around the pandemic beginning.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure that did change a lot of how this kind of stuff worked.
yeah, like I had to dredge up records from my Google Drive to be like, when did this happen, and what can I say that I'm remembering correctly? But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it was a fairly standard freelancer type situation where
Okay.
you know
Okay.
you you did the work and you fixed what needed to be fixed, and tacit approval.
So would you say that your time with Cubicle 7 there was like how does Cubicle 7 compare to other companies you've worked with?
Uh, See, that might be an unfair comparison because I've worked for some companies that were really above and beyond.
Really? Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I edited Putrescent Regnant for the Stockholm Cartel and Games Omnivorous, which is a doom sludge metal album with a campaign setting attached to it that's official for Mork Borg. And
Okay.
they were pretty great.
Yeah.
I mean, on top of being able to say that I worked on a project that Wayne June, the narrator for Darkest Dungeon, was a part of, which is a thing I can
What?
say. Yeah,
That's awesome.
I mean, he didn't say anything that I wrote, but I can still
Damn it.
say that, right? But and that was primarily editing context and translation from Swanglish to English and making sure
Mm,
context is kept.
yeah.
But that was a great job, and I was unaware that I was part of a stretch goal for like it was like a double payment thing, and I'm like, oh, so you're only paying me the you're giving me a bonus on this thing. They're like, oh no, we're paying you the exact sum we originally paid you, but now again. I'm like, oh, okay.
That's awesome.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I mean that paid some rent.
if I may ask, what is Swanglish?
Oh, Swanglish in that case was English by way of people who are speaking Swedish originally,
Oh,
because
okay, okay, yeah, yeah,
Stockholm
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Cartel out of Stockholm, and I mean they do speak English, of course, and,
Right.
very fluently, but they're writing there, and some things are
Yeah,
contextually lost, and it's like, okay, let me
yeah,
adjust that. I was essentially doing transcription, transliteration, localization work on that project.
yeah. That is actually very interesting because you do see in a lot of places where uh, even if they like speak English fluently, like to the point where you wouldn't be able to tell that they weren't a first language English speaker. Um, it seems like it's always reflected in their in how they write in English, where it's like it's always subtly different from how a first language English speaker would write something.
Oh yeah, and I'm happy to say that I've realized people hire me because I have a very distinct writing voice in most of my products, as I am not one for brevity. I have
Right.
learned that the hard way. But
Right.
it's just like if you want to have something sound like it's being shouted by an insane whaler on like trying to get people on the docks, it's like, oh yeah, I can make a monologue out of the lighthouse. I've got that rage in me.
Is there any way that I could read your dissertation on giant like random tables?
I'm actually working on making that into a potential available thing where I'm going to try and break that down for people
Let's
because
go.
I keep attempting new things with sandbox design
Yeah.
and iterative design. And like, I've been stepping more into the automation of the process of like, I can write a book that, and I recently did write a full manuscript for a company that's like 95% all random tables, and almost all
Right.
of them feed into one another. And it's good, useful material to have.
Right.
But
Yeah.
my goodness, I'm asking you to break your hand rolling those dice physically to get everything you want. Whereas I can give that all at the click of a button, all
Yeah.
these permutations and the various powers by that they multiply by in probability. Oh, that's what I want to do. So I've been revisiting my dissertation, a bunch of other things, and just trying to figure out how I can make that approachable, consumable content for people who want to actually, read into this because I tried doing that year one of the pandemic of just like I want to try and better understand this field I work in.
Yeah.
And boy howdy, I don't think most people know how to describe yeah, what's it called? West Marches campaign, including
Oh
in
God.
sometimes even the creator of it, because I've done my research on their statements, and it's just like, yes, but you're not telling me what this is.
Right. Oh my God. And
And
it doesn't help that West March's campaigns in general are just the most chaotic, confusing messes possible.
oh yeah, and I've addressed that in things I've worked on, where it's just like support structures allow you to get the things that you
Yeah.
want when you hear a word like West Marches, but people don't make those support structures for you. Like, you need to have a reason why the person you were just working with isn't actually here today and somebody else is.
Yeah.
And you need to make that something that buys into the narrative, thematic, you know, cohesion of this world.
Yeah.
Like, nobody wants to be like, oh, I got kidnapped and now I'm back next session.
Right.
But
Yeah, cuz
but if
what
it's just like,
happened? What?
if it's literally the case of like, oh, we were traveling with a doppelganger of the character from last session, like, and okay, well that's bad. They're not here anymore. And then next session when they show up, it's like they just sort of walk out of the woods having been jumped by that doppelganger. It's just like, but you couldn't tell, just the
Right.
use of in media res to create sort of the narrative coda is such a
Yeah.
useful tool, and it's not really present anywhere. It needs to be,
Yeah. Cuz
but
cuz
that's an aside.
one of the big reasons why I wanted you on the show was because I myself am kind of a I don't know, aspiring tabletop game designer myself. I'm trying to get into that with a few homebrew systems of my own. And one of the things I do in fact really struggle with is random roll tables. I don't know how to make them. They seem easy. It's not. It's really not easy. uh, so yeah, the moment that dissertation is available publicly, please let me know because I will eat that up. I will actually consume it and incorporate it into my brain matter.
Okay, well, I so just because you said you don't know how to do it, so I'm trying to remember when this was written, because this was really allowed me to think. Joseph Manola of the blog Udan-Adan wrote a whole post about the various forms of random table generation, in which you have things that are either completely eclectic and therefore seem weightless, things that lean into stereotype and thus may as well be just, like, oh, the dwarf, beard iron hand. And it's like, okay, well, that's. And then you have, I believe it's free imaginative, in which case you're just making it up on the spot. And my takeaway from that article was just, if tables exist for the purposes of generating something that needs to feel bespoke and whole cloth, it needs to be designed in that way. And that
Okay.
often means being a little bit deeper than a Sparks table, which is usually your one word answers for the various things you have in front of you,
Right.
which is fine for prep. But if you really wanted to make something that feels like you're pulling it out of a book of random encounters that are really well tailored, you have to put in all of that work on each and every single line. And
Yeah.
that is a hard ask. But if you do that, you subvert those issues entirely, because everything has meaning, and you also don't run into the issue of, well, this random encounter, it's going to get in the way of the plot, it's going to kill us. It's like, no, every single thing here was determined by random happenstance. Your plot came about this way, this iteration, by way of random happenstance. So everything here is equally valid in how much it might just ruin your day.
Really?
And
Yeah,
that
that yeah.
and that's what I pursue, because you
Yeah.
never want to have part of your work feel extraneous,
Right,
because you
right.
may as well just cut it that.
Cuz if you do have like a bunch of extraneous garbage within your, you know,
Yeah.
system that's just clogging things up, you end up getting a lot of pages that are basically just wasted paper.
Yeah, I think another, just as a last sort of tangent on that note, the Nave system, which is an OSR sort of tool set system, roll under, roll over as you see fit thing.
Yeah.
It's a very good lingua franca, but it has, because it is free to remix and whatever. It has a set of like, oh, hairstyles, body types, and pretty much everyone who makes a version of it uses those without changing them. And it's like, no, change these. These are just, this is a good framework, but please tell me why this is important. Or like, I want to see how this would change because you're changing the way in which we're viewing this. We're changing the way in which we're viewing a setting that will be using a similar set of these rules.
Yeah.
And most people don't. And like, I don't fault them for that, but it's just like what I want out of this.
Right. Yeah. 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 So you're very clearly like super knowledgeable on this sort of stuff, and clearly have a lot of experience in the industry. So are you like able to fully support yourself financially with your freelance work, or do you have like a kind of day job on the side as well?
So herein lies the issue of freelancing in general is that it is feast or famine.
Hmm.
And it is always that way. Whenever I think that I've entered a long period of like success and stability on just freelance alone, something happens and then it compounds into a famine state.
Right.
And it's a very vicious cycle.
Hmm.
Especially when you have things like balancing the interpersonal relationships with smaller publishers and when things don't go to plan and but that whole thing last year with the Suez Canal and how that backed up a lot of people's publishing deals
Yeah,
and
I can imagine.
just knowing also all the inside baseball and the various factionalism that occurs within the publishing
Mm,
communities.
yeah.
It's often the case of like if I could find a job that would pay me enough for my dignity, I'd take it. But I haven't had one of those in a while.
Yeah.
But
Um. So.
I worked. I think my last like honest job was I was a ditch digger working
Oof,
for the state of New York.
oof.
It was good work. I
Yeah.
didn't have to deal with anybody, just listen to podcasts and dig holes.
Right. Honestly, that kind of sounds almost relaxing in a weird way. But
Yeah,
I'm sure there were times where it wasn't.
yeah.
So would you say that like that kind of feast or famine cycle within freelance work, would you say that's because like freelance writing for tabletop RPGs is like a competitive field? Is it because there's always more writers than people who need writing or something, I guess?
I would actually not say that because and this is me showing now a decade of growth from having been in the field.
Okay.
Uh, you don't really have competition for jobs unless you're the kind of person who would make those people your competition.
Mm,
Everything can build off anything that's in the field. We are all effectively, whether anyone wants to admit it or not, working in a form of like academic writing where somebody creates something and then through precedent of seeing what worked and what didn't work, people build off of that and then people
yeah.
build off of that person's work. And so when you do make like bad blood in this field because you view somebody as having gotten this job over you, it's that really doesn't do anything to help you at all.
Right.
No,
Okay.
and so like I've met people like that who have been weirdly like jealous of me, where it's just like I mean I was recent. It's like I'm highly unmedicated. There's a reason why I'm hyper focusing on making tables for 12 hours a day.
Right.
Don't be jealous of me, please. Please send help.
This is
But
not fun.
yes, I'm not doing this by choice. But so there's always plenty of work available.
Yeah.
And we also like very nicely do live in an age where if you have something you want to make, you can just publish that for yourself and it will be about as respectable as getting published by any number of other people. You'll have your name on it, you'll retain the rights to it, and you can probably make pizza money with it, which is oftentimes, what you're getting from a paid bigger writing job after
Right. Yeah.
taxes and the amount of time it takes to get to you comes through. So yeah, I would say it is better to try and get into the field and look for comrades who view what you're doing with curiosity and interest rather than people who kind of want to sell you on a rivalry or, just
Interesting.
sort of
Yeah.
use what you're doing.
It's less competitive, more cooperative then, I guess.
Ideally.
Yeah.
Or rather, as a freelancer entering the
Of
field,
course.
that's how you should
Yeah.
desire to view it. Like, trust me,
Right.
I am incredibly jaded, but that is how when I like, because I did a mentor mentee thing with somebody new to the field last year, and it was like it was a very fulfilling experience because I was able to try and garner that sensation in another person, and that helped me be a little bit less jaded and cynical because like there are other people
Interesting.
who don't know, the how many crocodiles are in these reeds. So let me do my best to make sure they are not eaten by them, but are also not like too terrified to get in the water.
Right. Yeah. That's yeah. Yeah. So sort of following off of that. So I guess you could say then that like a lot of creative fields, getting into it can seem kind of intimidating, but is maybe actually like almost more of a mindset thing.
Yes, I would say the greatest barrier to entry is the illusion of professionalism.
Yeah.
Like, so my first relatively large job in the field was I got to write for Necrotic Gnome's Wormskin zine and its Dolmenwood setting as a whole. And I got that by way of, and this would be the general advice I give to someone brand new. Find a thing in this field that you love, like you're really vibing with, and that will not just be like in quotations D&D. Like for pick a setting and then pick a region within that setting that you really like. Don't just be like generic in this case.
Yeah.
Find something so specific in it that you love and then make stuff to support that and fill in the gaps that you would personally use were you to run this because
Okay. Okay.
why not?
Yeah.
And I mean, I did that for Dolmenwood, and it got to the point where uh, my blog and such was coming up on Google searches right there at the top with theirs, and they couldn't ignore me anymore, so they hired me.
Right.
And so maybe that'll be a bit harder with larger corporate games, but I mean, I specifically was able to get that job working on a Champions of Order by just showing the head of the head of the IP for Cubicle 7, just like, hey, look what I can do. Look what
Yeah.
I'm.
Yeah.
It's a utility that shows that I do care about this and want other people to be able to care about it more easily.
So, as a freelancer or as a freelance writer for Soulbound, actually that does. Uh, how much community interaction did you have? Like, how much time did you spend as a writer, so sort of interacting with the fandom? I guess since you were a writer that kind of came from the fandom.
Ah, that's a good question. I didn't really spend all that much time talking to other fans because a lot of it definitely, like, specifically having been someone who cut their teeth running Dark Heresy and
Right.
knowing that fandom, not that I would assume the same fandom, but it's like everyone has their preconceived like perceptions.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was me just being like, I desire to know more of the raw data to work on this and to understand like the themes and stuff. So I didn't really interact with the community at
Okay.
all, though I did begin following a lot of people who did interesting kit bashes regarding factions I liked and just trying to figure out like, okay, I can see how these expressions can work together and make like an interesting idea and how can I like reconcile and compartmentalize that to better flesh out, say, like these fire slayers who had, maybe two sentences of lore for their specific lodge before I got to work on them.
Yeah.
And so that was pretty much the bulk of my interactions. Like I definitely began watching a lot more
Okay.
people who paint miniatures. I
Yeah.
think I interacted with 2 Plus Tough in the
Oh,
comments of
yeah.
a video, but I don't remember which. Oh no, I remember which one it was on now. It was prior to the Dominion set coming out, and everyone was expecting Chaos Dwarves, and it was like,
Oof.
hey, I was allowed to reference the Legions of Asgore in one of these Fire Slayer entries, and nobody said, Brian, you're not allowed to do that.
Right.
So,
Yeah, yeah. Cause I do remember back when Age of Sigmar first came out, there was the legions of the I think they were actually, yeah, called the Legions of Asgore. They were the Chaos Dwarves made by Forge World.
yes.
Um and they just randomly got discontinued one day, and their books were erased from the canon of the world when third edition came out. And I remember a lot of people were really confused about that. Specifically, I knew one person who actually had a full Legions of Asgore army, who was not too pleased with his army basically being erased from the game.
Yeah. I mean, I never I could never certainly afford the Legions of Asgore like models from Forge World,
Yeah, no, Christ.
but I really love their concept. Like,
Mm-hmm.
especially in sort of like some of the newer-ish by comparison art for them, where it really leans more into the demonic with them,
Right, right.
and just like, oh, I love all this thematic energy, like
Mm-hmm.
revolving around fire and like Moloch, and like these are
Right.
interesting twists going in here. And this is a unique expression specifically of like a few different forms of like violence and hatred that the other chaos gods just don't touch on.
Right. Yeah, that's actually, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I'm actually really like hyped for the for them showing up, because like the horns of
Mm-hmm.
Hashut, I know people were just like, why are they humans? And it's like, because Hashut's the god of slavery.
Right.
That's why.
Like, and I do remember back in ye olden Warhammer Fantasy days, especially during like the older editions, where Chaos Dwarfs were kind of yikes in a way,
Yeah.
where their art and their model line was very clearly supposed to uh, make them resemble uh, certain Middle Eastern Abrahamic religions. Um,
Yeah, it's certainly an issue of trying to combine certain dwarven aesthetics with Mesopotamian and Babylonian aesthetics on that smallest
right,
scale with the tools of the
right.
time, where even if it was unintentional,
Oh,
goodness gracious, we're at some
yeah. We're glad to be
big
moving away
pygmy
from that.
halfling tier issues in play.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm, like it's one of those things where I will not crucify them for attempting to do better now, but I do
Oh,
not want to look back on that
yeah.
period.
No, let's not. Let's stay far away from that.
Yes.
Um. So very clearly, you've been a fan of Warhammer, both versions of Warhammer, for a very long time.
Mhm.
Certainly longer than I. Jesus. Um. So through your sort of experience as a fan of Warhammer 40k, Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, would you agree with the, I guess, widely held belief that Age of Sigmar's community is generally friendlier and more welcoming than something like Warhammer 40Ks or even Warhammer Fantasies?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I would hold that. I would say that the Warhammer fantasy community, and this is me being uncharitable,
Right.
uh, exists now in the context of, the Total War games and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is to say you're not getting a lot of people who are, throwing a fit that their Empire army is not getting the update. No, it was always the Bretonian players who were doing that, and
Right.
now they don't exist anymore.
And now they don't
But
exist anymore.
I, yeah. So I don't have any issues with the fantasy community. I would definitely say the Age of Sigmar community uh does appear to be friendlier than the 40K community, but at the same token, it's the case of, given some of the 40K community's
Right.
imagery, it's kind of not surprising that it attracted that crowd for this long. So, which I guess, and once again, this is me being kind of uncharitable. I would say the Age of Sigmar community is as friendly as a community ought to be on the
Right.
baseline of how friendly communities are. It's just not in the negatives. I wouldn't
Mm,
necessarily put it on a pedestal as like an apex of champions and goodness, but like it's certain you can certainly find far worse communities within the same hobby.
yeah. Oh,
I've
for
never had
sure.
any issues from it.
Yeah. 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 Like I've never personally been called a slur by a a person with an Age of Sigmar profile picture yet. Um,
You're less likely to have somebody try to invoke the Deus Vult mentality
ugh,
with Age of Sigmar.
gross.
And on
Yeah.
some level, I feel like that's because they perceive it to be childish compared to 40K, which is
Mm,
very funny, if it wasn't also very sad.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's certainly a thing, and I do think that a big I honestly think a big part of the reason why that difference exists, and I do think that difference does definitely exist, just from my own
Yeah.
personal experiences interacting with both fandoms. I think a big part of the reason why that exists is a difference in how the setting kind of portrays its characters. And I talked a little bit about this um in my first Age of Sigmar versus 40K video, uh where I kind of bring down the big difference between 40K and Age of Sigmar as being a difference between setting and narrative. Where 40K is very much about maintaining the status quo. Everything in did I say Age of Sigmar or 40K? 40K exists to maintain the status quo. Everything within the 41st millennium is trying to keep things as they are. Where in Age of Sigmar, things radically change regularly. So the fans of Age of Sigmar are sort of more primed to like be ready for change as opposed to 40K fans, so they get way less defensive over their setting
Yeah.
because they view it as more inherently malleable than 40K fans, where like 40K fans get weirdly defensive over like weirdly trivial differences in interpretation of the lore.
Yeah, and that does baffle me on some level because
Right.
I mean, and this is me having gotten to work on Morkborg, Morkborg. I just call him
Morkborg.
Morkborg because it has the umlauts.
Ugh.
For on as much stuff because I also got to work on Cyborg as a like official product from them, and it's just if you're working on a subject matter that is inherently dark and inherently risky, and everything keeps getting worse, you need to be having fun with that. You don't
Right.
want to be like, let's preserve the status quo of how bad things already are. It's like, no, I want to be very much looking forward to how much worse this can get. Like that to me is what makes it that sort of apocalyptic vibe
Right.
interesting.
That's actually, yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree with that. Yeah.
I mean, it's also it leans into like, I mean, we can go into the whole Imperium as heroes issue
Ugh.
anyway, but it leans into the nature of the the end is come, ergo nothing matters, or rather everything matters because nothing matters. What you do with that precious time you have left because existentialism is a burning fireball coming for you
Right.
all matters because that's how you're choosing to spend the remainder of your consciousness. And it also leans into the boldness of like, if I'm gonna go out, I may as well go out fighting because I'm going out either way in 10 hours. So
Right. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so like that leans into the sort of the funness of the darkness. And I have thoughts on the Imperium branding stuff, and oh god, they're so close to being able to do it right in a way without even having to without having to change their excuse, and it bothers me they don't take it, but that's
God,
because
it's so
personally,
frustrating because I think I know what you're talking about, and yeah, it really is just it's so frustrating to see because now
yeah.
Games Workshop has to do this thing where like every 7 or 8 months they have to release an official statement to remind people that you're not supposed to think the Imperium is cool.
See, my issue with it, and it's almost similar, is that like think of the Imperium of Man as Jason Voorhees.
Right,
He's on
yeah.
all of the posters. He's
Right.
butchering those teens. He's covered in blood. He's freakish and monstrous and horrible and unstoppable. Nobody is watching a Friday the 13th movie and saying
You
Jason
know,
is the hero.
Jason Jason kind of has a point. Nobody's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." You know, Jason's just doing what he has to do to save humanity.
Yeah, it's just like even in the few times within Friday the 13th where it might be arguable that Jason's violence is on some level justified,
Yeah, like
which is really just the first one, and that's
right.
not even Jason. Spoilers for a 30-plus-year-old movie.
Right.
Uh, it's just like,
How
hey,
dare you?
you may have your feelings on this are completely valid. Your actions you have taken in blind vengeance are horrific. And that's like, yeah. So, I would gladly like I would and I would read a Heroes of the Imperium book that has a sister of battle who's drenched in blood like she's Carrie at the prom, and it just says here like blessed are the martyrs story collection. It's like if you portray the Imperium as the horrific, brutal oppressors they are and use those terms like hero and such with them, it at least then would become a commentary on how these words can lionize evil things and make people twist them to be viewed in a positive light. Like,
Yeah.
versus, I don't want to see these immaculately cleaned, armored space marines. That's not
Right.
that doesn't work for me. That doesn't they're not supposed to be heroes. They're child soldiers who've been radicalized by a cult, and then many of them have been disillusioned from it, and it's just like, yeah, what do you do? You can't retire.
Yeah, you can't walk away from the things you've done, but
You're not allowed to not live on grounds. You have to
right.
drink the sacred Kool-Aid. And it's like, okay, how depressing. And
Right.
that is alone is like you have all these fascinating angles, but by playing
Yeah.
into a very like superhero versus supervillain look at things, it just doesn't do it for me, which is
Right.
I realize is an unfair way of me saying I could never really get into the Horus heresy because I mean this I get it, but I it lacks that fun intimacy of
Yeah.
when you have a smaller character in a situation. Like, I would much rather read about like just a low tier scum ganger on some planet
Right.
getting into a situation than space marines doing a
And
thing, unless it's fun.
and I mean, we've seen those kinds of stories work really well. I mean, look at how well received Necromunda Underhive or Necromunda Hired Gun. Look at how
Yes.
successful and popular Necromunda Hired Gun was among the 40K community. And like all that is a game where you're playing as like a literal hired gun in like the dirtiest city in the Imperium.
Oh yeah, I think, and this is an important thing that I do think gets lost. Warhammer as a whole, all of its various products run on vibes more
Right.
than anything.
Right.
Like what is that one? Sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the artist who. Yes, that is Warhammer. Looking at that, that is what Warhammer is.
Mark Gibbons.
I was thinking of Adrian Smith, but
Adrian Smith is also a good example. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yes. And so it's like, yes, you get it. You
Right.
are sold on those vibes. The models are a replication of that. They're not going to be a direct one to one.
Right.
That's fine. But when you're working in like a video game, I kind of want to see those vibes carried over.
Yeah.
Like maybe not 100%, but like I enjoyed the Space Marine video game because it did that very successfully
Oh
with
yeah.
regards to a sense of scale and a sense of power while also allowing you to also feel, ganged up on, which that's a delicate balance of how do you not, make a make the bad guys feel like they're supposed to be big and tough and you take them out in a punch. You know,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
like you got to play with scale and perspective.
I think I think that is kind of a consistent aspect of a lot of the games that are the most popular among the Warhammer community is games like Vermintide 2
Oh, love
and
Vermintide.
and Mechanicus and Space Marine and maybe Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, maybe. Uh,
I
all,
haven't heard a lot of people talk about that in a while,
all
but
very much kind of capture the vibe of the setting really well.
yeah,
Um, it's kind of a tired meme. It really makes you feel like Spider-Man. It really makes you feel like a tech priest who's exploring and
yeah.
going
It's
through
it's
this tomb world. It's
it's immersion by way of gimmick, and gimmick is a
right
dirty word that shouldn't be because it's like no,
because
that's why this is fun.
gimmicks are
It's
great. I love gimmicks.
yeah, and so it's just like yeah, how would a game in which you are a tech priest play? Like this? Why not? That's interesting. That's
Yeah.
different than other things on the market. Uh, I mean, hell, all of Vermintide is really just a case of what if we put a bunch of people in the Left 4 Dead situation, but they all hate each other
But they
and
oh
they're never going to change. And it's like, yes, the fact that 90% of their bantering is them just insulting and getting angry at one another is like, yeah, as you would. As you would. Everything is terrible, and these are the
right.
only people you can rely on, and you wish it was anyone else.
Especially since once you get to Vermintide 2, the banter is still very much like that, but it's more endearing, I guess, where it's like even though, Carillion and Barden still very clearly dislike each other, they dislike each other in the same way that like people who are very much trauma bonded dislike each other.
Yeah,
Where
they have the office familiarity.
right, exactly,
They don't
where,
like each other, but they will sass on salts pyre while they're in a meeting because he
Right.
spilled something. It's
Right.
like, yeah,
Like they have that level of connection that makes them come off almost as friends, even though they're arguably kind of not.
yeah, they
Yeah.
it's a rare talent to be able to see, like, or rather, it's a rare talent to be able to write that specific sort of companionship that is literally just intense familiarity.
Right.
Like, I'm aware of all of your foibles and characteristics, and I don't have deeper thoughts on them because I don't care enough, but I do know them. I'm not curious as to why you're doing this thing. I just am like, we're supposed to be doing this other thing right now.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you don't usually get that in a lot of the media that we consume, but it's also like kind of a very human thing. Like, you know, going through elementary school or high school when you're in a class with 30 plus other people,
Jesus.
you don't know everybody, but you're familiar enough with them that you know, like, the gist of it. And it's like, I don't really like these people, but if they're my lab partner, I'm not gonna, like, you know, pull blades or anything. Just let's just
Right.
get this done. We're just trying to get this done to get a passing grade and get out of here.
Right. So I've had an excellent time talking with you today. It's been great fun.
Yeah,
Um,
enjoyed it too.
uh, However, we have one last question from people who pay me to ask you questions. um, this one comes from Lucifer King, who asks, "Do you read any Warhammer literature, such as the Horus Heresy slash Solar War novels, Caiaphas Cain, Gotrek and Felix, insert Age of Sigmar example here, etc." So sort of looping back around how we were talking about the Horus Heresy earlier.
Yeah.
What is your experiences, opinions, and sort of takes on Warhammer books?
Uh, some of them can be really good, which I realize is probably not the nicest way to say that, but let me put it like this: I've the ones that I really like are apparently not the ones people love to talk about, and I
Right.
I guess it's because on some level they're done. The Black Hearts series for fantasy
Yeah.
was a favorite. I got the first book of that at a church book sale, like a swap meet thing, maybe a decade ago. That was just like the church a block away from my house. I was like, oh hey, books. Very fun. I enjoyed it. It had a vibe sort of vaguely like Sharp's Rifles series, but it's in the Warhammer fantasy world. Everyone's miserable. It's got some good tropes from sort of the period literature of, like, the general, like, shot and pike era, with trying to remember just one of the main, like, lady characters is wearing a fake beard for most of it just because she's working with a bunch of criminals, and as a result everyone assumes that the main character is a gay man and that's why he must be incriminated at this time, and it's like that's not it at all, but that's an interesting concept to see presented in, like,
Yeah.
2003, because it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, hey, you take what you can get at the time, but
Right.
at the same point, considering, like, some remarks in, like, very early Gotrek and Felix, it's like this feels more like having to be aware and conscientious of what's being said because it's not a gag, it's a trait of the story. But as far as more recent things I've enjoyed, The Court of the Blind King by David Geimer is probably the best Age of Sigmar thing I've read in a
Yeah.
good long time. Uh, really good characters, really interesting characterizations. I enjoyed that. It very much encapsulated why the Ideneth are an interesting faction. That is because
Right.
they're literally just the the Dark Eldar. And my God, they work so well in fantasy. They work better than Dark Elves in fantasy.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, we're gonna steal some souls and do some biopunk horror shit.
Yeah, and I do think it's especially good because IdenFDP and I feel are one of those factions that get very heavily misrepresented, or
Oh yeah.
or perhaps more accurately, most heavily stereotyped than other factions.
We
Where
didn't even talk about what I wrote for Champions of Orders because I wrote the Fire Slayer stuff, and
ooh,
that's that 100%.
yeah,
They're very
yeah.
cool people. They're
I freaking love the Fire Slayers, dude. They're
they're
one of my favorite Age of Sigmar
raging
factions.
bodhisattvas seeking ego death so their god can mantle them like it's something out of Morrowind. This was all written textually before I even got to make that even a tiny bit more overt in Champions of Order. They are the most interesting faction.
oh,
I say that
oh yeah,
unabashedly.
oh yeah,
They really need to forefront the importance of the Doomgron because that right there is some like holy shit interesting stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I do kind of relate to your thoughts on like, oh, the series of books I like are the ones that no one ever talks about, because some of my favorite like 40K books are Nick Kime's Salamander series. Um, I also understand that Nick Kime is kind of a controversial writer in the Warhammer literature space, because people really don't like how he wrote in the Horus Heresy series. Um, and I do think that his work in the Horus Heresy kind of falls into the pitfall that a lot of Horus Heresy writers have, where they treat the Legion as basically being unchanged from how they are in 40K, where Nick Kime definitely wrote his salamanders like how he writes his salamanders in 40K, but in the Horus Heresy, which is not accurate to how they actually are, and it makes them seem more one-dimensional. But I think the Tome of Fire trilogy is one of my favorite pieces of Warhammer literature in general, and yeah, nobody talks about it, even though it's like actually what established all of the lore we have today for the salamanders.
I didn't even know those books existed. But I also don't really read Space Marine related literature.
Yeah. Cause originally the salamanders were a rogue trader era Space Marine chapter, but then for third edition they got their own army list for the Codex War of Armageddon book. Um, which is when their color scheme changed. That's when they got all their like modern heraldry and the big emphasis on them kind of almost being like space dwarves but not squats, because they
Yeah.
have that big focus on living in mountain volcanoes and being like master craftsmen and stuff like that. But it was Nick Kime's Tome of Fire series that introduced a lot of their like compassion and empathy and their relationship to fire and why they're so obsessed with it, other than just being pyromaniacs, which, let's be clear, they are. But I find it really interesting, and I also find it kind of sad that nobody ever talks about those books. And yeah, like you said, most people don't even know they exist. Because without those books, it is very easy to see the salamanders kind of the same way that if the Emperor had a text-speech device saw them, where they're just like regular Space Marines, but aggressively nice for no reason.
Yeah. Ugh. I got thoughts on Space Marines, but yeah.
Yeah, I do too. I've been thinking about making a video where I more go into detail about my thoughts on Space Marines, because obviously my name is a chapter of Space Marines. It's very intentionally meant to be a chapter of Space Marines. It's my favorite part of the setting, and but not uncomplicatedly my favorite part of the setting, if that makes sense, right? Where it's like Space Marines are definitely one of my favorite things about 40K, but it's also I have a lot of opinions about why they are that way.
Yeah. And gosh, just is controversial take that
Okay.
I will present now at the end of this.
Yeah.
Every time I see somebody defending the no lady Space Marines thing, it's like, look, I listen to you, but you're not even using the interesting thematic components of making them men
Right.
exacerbated by masculine isolation and loneliness that is like conceptually present. You're doing nothing
Oh,
with that
exactly. Yeah.
and the child soldier aspect and the radicalization aspect. If you were doing something with that, I would say I understand your position because we're talking about what is thematically resonant to these items regarding the broader audience and how they can relate to that. It doesn't mean that you should remain like shackled to
Right.
not allowing it to be changed, but I would at least be like, I understand what you're saying. I don't
Right.
agree with it as you are like seeing it, but I understand the importance of these themes. But no, it's never that. And it's just like,
The
gosh,
people always arguing in favor of restricting Space Marines to always being male do so almost exclusively from the perspective of wanting to sanitize them into being a very uncomplicated, toxic masculine power fantasy, rather than being an actually interesting piece of literature.
yeah. And it's, gosh, it's
and
just,
and I do think that actually is a big source of a lot of my issues with the more toxic elements of the 40K fandom, where they don't want to think about 40K, and
yeah,
Anna talk about this a lot. People who vehemently defend the lore of 40K staying exactly how it is right now are also the same people who give that lore the least amount of actual thought.
yeah.
They
Like,
they engage with the setting more on the level of, oh, this is the caliber and muzzle velocity of a bolter, and that matters for some reason, rather than like, this is what a bolter represents thematically. And I think it leads to their understanding of the setting being significantly poorer and less, not less advanced, but definitely less thoughtful than some other ways of thinking about the setting.
they're caring about the wrong thing. They're caring
Right.
that they care that the gun is cool, not the fact that it just obliterated three gangers who had like trusted in that weird four-headed ridge person in the basement who told them they could dream of a better life. It's like
Right.
that's what makes a bolter interesting, is that it's a friggin' railgun pistol that obliterates people who might have hope. It's the literal iron fist of oppression being thrown at you from half a mile away.
Yeah, but the only thing they get from that is, whoa, gun cool. It's like, fuck off, dude.
It's literally that meme of just like,
Right.
wow, cool gun. Oh god.
Right. Ugh. Ugh.
Which is why I do like the Stormcast a bit more than I thought
Oh.
I would
Oh
originally.
yeah.
Just the tragedy of memory loss and or also ego death,
Yeah.
and all of them maybe not have been willing to sign up knowing about that originally,
Yeah.
and now stuck in it, kind of having to deal with the issue of, do we tell the new meat that this is going to happen? And the fact that the person asking that may have had that conversation 10 other times that day because they can't remember it. It's like, oh, Sigmar is weaponizing dead people who should not be around anymore, and it's essentially like vaguely Alzheimer related imagery, but also like the soul should not persist like this
Right.
kind of,
Yeah. It's
you
like,
know,
how do you I And I think that's kind of one of the big things Age of Sigmar has over 40K is that they do take those and they run with them a lot more. Whereas
Oh
like,
yeah.
how do you tell the new guy that like we all eventually become Necrons, basically? Like, how,
I'm trying to remember which short story because it was part of one of those audio collections they do on Audible where there
yeah,
is a Stormcast in there who gets reforged and he has like a really bad time because he sees like a flower and he knows it's important. He does not remember why. And
right,
he like hyper obsesses about it because if he's remembering this but doesn't know why, that might mean somebody like whammied him and now he's just like, oh no, there's like an evil sorceress or something. And their partner, who's just like working with them, is just like, I cannot deal with telling my friend my friend in arms like that this flower represents a love that they once had but they perished and then have come back for hundreds of years now and all they can remember is like the lingering importance of this flower until that fades and like they can't remember the name of that lover but they'd be so much more unhappy if they knew that's what it was related to and it's like god the weight of all of that to the point where it's just like Sigmar you son of a bitch why would you do this to people
right, yeah,
and then with
and
you
yeah,
as we start just to bookend it and if you go back to wow Sigmar you coward look at all the damage you allowed to happen in your hubris look at all the people you've hurt trying to put the genie back in the bottle
right, yeah. I think that is an excellent note to end on. Thank you
hey,
for being on the show today, for taking time out of your no doubt incredibly busy schedule to be on my show that gets a new episode once every celestial alignment. um, I had an excellent time. I think we talked about a lot of really good stuff.
yeah this was fun enjoyed talking
As a final remark, would you like to remind people where they can find you, how they can get into contact with you, and maybe some things that you're currently working on that they can maybe keep a bit of an eye on?
sure so once again I am Brian Yaksha you can find me online at Goatman's Goblet both on Twitter and also as a blog spot I think that I still have the domain paid for let's
Maybe.
see. As for yeah, maybe. As for projects and products, uh I'm working on a new thing that should be going to Kickstarter maybe next month with Soul Muppet Publishing. It's called Throne of Avarice. It's a big setting toolkit book about working for what is essentially 1800s early modern Dutch East India Company if they were founded by Vikings evil capitalists, which is a whole
Awesome.
thing.
That
Let's
sounds
see.
sick.
If you pick up Frontier Scum by Games Omnivorous, I got to write on the setting for that and talk about the interesting thing of sensitivity writing on Westerns that are not actually set in the real world, but still have to borrow from the imagery of it and how to balance that out. Uh, God, I feel like there's another thing that I did recently. Oh, I just did some stretch goals for Gangs of Titan City, which is a Necromunda-esque RPG, also by Soul Muppets.
Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
I'm trying to remember if I've actually done anything for myself recently, and I don't think I have. But yeah, so that's all that.
All right. Thank you again so much for being on the show. That is Brian Yaksha. And if you've gotten this far into the episode, thank you so much for listening. And please give your kind words to our guest here because they were great. I loved doing this, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.